Spoiling the Insidious movies before The Red Door comes out on Friday. Insidious Chapter 3 is a prequel. It takes place 3 years before the Lambert family saga. Insidious 3 is about this teenage girl named Quinn. At the beginning of the movie, we see Quinn go to meet with Elise, who of course by this point we all know. And Quinn asks Elise to help her contact her mother who died a year prior. It doesn't go well and Elise senses this negative force and encourages Quinn to never try this again. Quinn goes home and she runs into this old woman Grace who lives in her apartment building. And Grace kind of says some cryptic shit to her, including seeing this spirit in her bedroom at night. And Quinn kind of just brushes it off. One day Quinn is outside of a school and she sees this ghostly figure waving at her. And distracted by the figure, she runs into the street and gets hit by a car and breaks both of her legs. So now she's basically confined to the apartment with her dad, Sean, and her brother, Alex. And Quinn starts to experience this weird paranormal shit, including seeing visions of this guy with an oxygen mask on, who we call the man who can't breathe. And Quinn quickly realizes that this is the same figure that she saw in the street the night of her accident. Meanwhile, Quinn's father learns that Grace, the old woman in the apartment building, has passed away. Sean ends up meeting with Elise, and we actually learn that her husband, Jack, recently passed away. And he tries to convince Elise to help Quinn because of these visions she's been having. But Elise says no because the last time that she went to the further and had contact with the spirit, she was followed by a bride in black, who we of course know from the previous 2 movies. She ends up meeting with her friend Carl, who we know from the last movie, and he's basically like, Elise, you've done this before with a young Josh back in 1986, you can do it again. So because Elise initially declines, Sean calls on these 2 paranormal investigators that he finds on the internet, Specs and Tucker, who again, we know from the previous movies, and at this point they are not associated with Elise. However, while they're there investigating, everything goes horribly wrong and Quinn actually ends up getting possessed by the man who can't breathe and attacks her dad and Specs and Tucker. But as they go to leave, obviously having failed, Elise arrives to save the day. Elise at this point explains that the spirits in the further are trying to lure people into their world so they can basically feed off of their life force. So she recruits Specs and Tucker and decides to go into the spirit world herself. So Elise willingly goes into the further, and when she gets there, she briefly encounters the bride in black. And she also sees Jack, her husband who passed away. And Jack encourages her to commit suicide so she can come join him. But that makes Elise realize that this is actually not her husband, and she discovers that it's the man who can't breathe. Elise tries to convince the man who can't breathe to leave Quinn alone, and as that's happening, Quinn then appears in the further with her. A struggle ensues between the 3 of them, and Elise realizes that Quinn needs to defeat him on her own. That's the only way it's going to work. Elise goes back to the real world and receives a message from Grace, the old woman who had died in the apartment. She tells Elise that Lily, Quinn's mom, left her a letter before she died, but Quinn never found it. So Elise is now like, holy shit, that's it, and she calls on Lily's spirit to help save Quinn. So now back in the further, we see Lily appear, and she talks to Quinn and basically gives her the strength to stand up and defeat the spirit. And she does so by pulling off his oxygen mask and suffocating him. She escapes the further and comes back to the real world, and Elise gives them these parting words that Lily told her, and we see this really beautiful shot of Lily's spirit standing in the doorway. After this is all over, Elise, Specs, and Tucker walk out, and they decide to form a partnership. So that's how this trio started. The movie ends with Elise going home, and while she's in bed, her dog starts to bark at something that we can't see and she can't see either. And behind her, she is being watched by a demon with a red face, leading us perfectly into the events of Insidious 1.